I went back to Berkeley, and I decided to join in January, and then in March I was initiated. So that was the next time I was able to see Srila Prabhupada at the same temple in La Cienega. That was 1970 in March. And the initiation was very interesting. What happened was there were a number of devotees being initiated. The devotee on my right, who was initiated as Paramatma, used to smoke cigarettes. The devotee on my left, who was initiated as Babrubahan, used to take a lot of LSD. So when it came time for them to recite the four regulative principles, they would recite them, and then Paramatma on my right, Prabhupada, after he recited the regulative principles, Prabhupada went like this. And he said, "What about smoking?" And he said, "Oh no, Prabhupada." So then I recited the regulative principles. Prabhupada gave me my name. He said, "Mahatma is the one who's always chanting the glories of the Lord." He didn't say anything else. Then it came time for Babrubahan. He recited the four regulative principles, and Prabhupada said, "What about LSD?" And he, of course, said, "Oh no, Prabhupada." So it's funny, they don't remember that. I distinctly remember that to this day. I don't know if the temple presidents told Prabhupada that they had those habits, or if Prabhupada knew it. Generally, we assume that he just knew. But I thought that was amazing that he made those remarks. And he was kind of laughing and smiling and pretending like he was smoking. The nice thing about being temple president in the early days is we were supposed to write Prabhupada a letter every month. We were supposed to tell him what was going on in our center, and then I could take advantage and ask questions. So one time we were doing traveling Sankirtan, and I was enjoying traveling and preaching. I didn't like to manage, so when I came back to the temple, I was experiencing all this anxiety. So I began thinking that on the road I can remember Krishna, but when I'm at the temple I just forget him. There's so many things to do. So I decided when I would give my report to Srila Prabhupada that I would ask a question. So I was thinking like this. I was thinking, is it better to do less service and think of Krishna more, or do more service and think of Krishna less? So those were my two options, although that's not the actual philosophy. So I wrote Prabhupada that letter. What should I do? Because I told him how when I was traveling it was so much easier to think of Krishna. So then he replied, his first sentence was, "The whole point of everything is to become absorbed in thoughts of Krishna." So when I heard Prabhupada say that, I felt guilty, I felt embarrassed, I felt this was impossible, to become absorbed in thoughts of Krishna, because I felt I was never thinking of Krishna. That's why I wrote Prabhupada, thinking of so many things other than Krishna. So he writes back, "The whole point of everything is to become absorbed in thoughts of Krishna." So I was, immediately I was thinking, this is impossible, I'm already at a loss. So then Prabhupada said, the way you do this is that you think that you have no qualification for your service. So Prabhupada told me in my situation, you should think that you have no qualification to be the temple president, and that you have to pray to Krishna to give you the qualification. So he said, you should think, Krishna, you should pray, Krishna, please give me the qualification, because if you don't give me the qualification, then all the devotees in the temple will leave. So he said, in that way, always remain dependent on Krishna, and then you'll always be able to think of Krishna. So he didn't say, do less service, think of Krishna more. That was never Prabhupada's mood. But his mood was, you should be dependent, and then by being dependent, you'll think of Krishna. So I thought that was very instructive. We had gone from Vancouver to all the towns between Vancouver and Edmonton, and we had spent most of our time in Calgary and Edmonton, and we had amazing response because no one knew what the Hare Krishna movement was. We were on TV, we were on radio, we were just young devotees, 19, 20 years old, very enthusiastic. And there was a large Hindu community, and we did programs with the Hindus. We were staying in two people's homes. We were doing Sunday feasts in their homes, getting 50, 60 people. Devotees were joining there. Ganapati Maharaj, we first met him there, and other devotees. So it was a phenomenal program, plus we were distributing Krishna books. So I wrote a letter to the devotees in Vancouver describing all the events. It was such an ecstatic Sankirtan party. But then the devotees took that letter and they sent it to Prabhupada. And actually I sent that letter to my wife, and I had a wart on my foot, which I'd had since I was 13. So at that time I was about 21. So she sent the letter to Prabhupada, and then she also asked him, do you have a cure for warts? Because at that time, devotees had that relationship where they were dependent on Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was in the pharmaceutical business. So a lot of times he would give us cures, and then we would also ask him for cures. So I had this wart since I was 13. And it was cut out many, many times, burned out, it would continually grow back. I just forgot about it. When I came back from that trip, the wart had gone. I thought, oh, this is, somehow or other it's gone. And then she later told me, said, when I sent that letter to Prabhupada, I asked him for a cure for warts. And somehow or other, this is a true story, somehow or other that wart disappeared. Whether it was by chance or Prabhupada did it, that we can try to understand, but I took it that somehow or Prabhupada did that. So that was an interesting pastime.
And it never came back.
Never came back. In the summer of 71, all the devotees from Vancouver went to the Rath Yatra in San Francisco, and Prabhupada was there as well. And because I was the temple president, I was told that in the evening there was going to be a temple president's meeting. And to this point, I had never been alone, not alone, but I'd never been with Prabhupada in an intimate setting. I'd only seen him giving class. I don't think at this point I'd even been on a morning walk. So the whole day of Rath Yatra I was thinking, what is this temple president's meeting? Is it some type of managerial meeting where there's going to be policies and strategies, like a corporate meeting? And so I was wondering all day. And that was the basic impression I had of a managerial meeting, and Prabhupada's going to set some policies and standards, show us how to take care of our books, organize, and so forth. So it wasn't anything like that at all. When we got into the room, as we were coming in one by one, Prabhupada gave us some prasadam off his plate, some dried fruit and nuts. And then he sat us down, and then the whole time he preached to us about preaching and opening more centers, because the mood in those days was to open centers. Prabhupada wanted 108 centers to be open. So even more than book distribution, I think at that time, opening centers was the focus. So he was preaching to us about opening centers. And the devotees were telling Prabhupada what they had done, and he was preaching to us about preaching, the importance of preaching and enthusing us and preaching to us. And that was the temple president's meeting, was Prabhupada preaching to us about preaching. And devotees telling Prabhupada about their preaching, and Prabhupada not talking about any details of the preaching other than, yes, open up more centers, preach, spread Krishna consciousness. So I thought that was very amazing. And then in my other experiences with Prabhupada, I was always interested in seeing how Prabhupada would manage, because we have to manage the society, and there are different styles of management. And I always wondered, how did Prabhupada manage the movement? Because generally you have the conception of a manager, especially of an international society, of someone with many secretaries, 3 or 4 telephones, big desks, so many things. So every time I was with Prabhupada, no management was going on. He was just preaching. Of course, I wasn't a GBC, but still, at least in my own experience with Prabhupada, there was never a time I was with him that he was rushing, as we may tend to do, on the phone, this emergency, that emergency. He had a totally different way of dealing with things, basically, as we know, through the mail. And every time I was with Prabhupada, he was either hearing about Krishna or preaching to devotees. And I would sit with him and I would think, how is Prabhupada managing this international society? Because every time I'm with him, he's always preaching. And he's not even talking about any of the problems, and he's not talking about management. And I was always just awestruck by the potency that Prabhupada had. When I was temple president in Vancouver, as I said, I was able to write Prabhupada. So at that time I was thinking we should form a rock band, because if we had a rock band, if we became famous, we would have influence over the young people. And I was imagining us playing and converting people to Krishna consciousness and making so much money at concerts that everyone who came to the concert would get a book. So I wrote Prabhupada a letter and I said, these rock stars, they have influence over the way young people think. They can totally change the way people are thinking. So what if we start a rock band and try to become famous, and then we can preach through that? So Prabhupada wrote me a letter, interesting letter. He said, this trying to become famous is all phantasmagoria. He said, you'll never become famous. He said, this is totally impractical. Why even try for it? He said, we don't want to become famous ourselves. He said, we want to make Krishna famous. And he said, if you want to do music, then use your musical ability to lead ecstatic kirtans in the temple in Vancouver. But don't try to become famous yourself. So when I wrote Prabhupada, I was thinking, at least at that time, I wasn't thinking of wanting to become famous. I was thinking if we became famous, we could use that for preaching. But actually, before I was a devotee, I had a very strong desire to become famous as a musician. So actually, Prabhupada saw that. It was very clear that he saw that. I actually didn't realize that if that wasn't one of my motives, it certainly would have become my motive, or I would have been adversely influenced by it. So that was Prabhupada's reply. Knowing exactly where I was at, he said, don't try to become famous. You'll never become famous. We don't want to become famous. And so he shattered. So after that, I totally ever forgot that desire of becoming famous, which was actually quite a strong desire before I was a devotee. That was one of my aspirations. So some morning walks, there is a picture that many devotees will remember where I'm standing behind Prabhupada, Hridhayananda Maharaj is there, Dhanavir Prabhu is there, many other senior devotees are there, and Prabhupada, and we're all laughing. Vikram Swami is there. Everybody's laughing, bursting out laughing. That shot is there in Your Ever Well Wisher. It's a still, and it was also published in BTG. So what were we all laughing about? So we were walking in Santa Monica, just north of the pier, and Rameshwar was describing book distribution in South America. How people were getting letters from people who had received books, who were appreciating books, who were living in places where there were no temples. So he was very impressed by that book distribution had gone so far and wide throughout South America that even people were getting books where there were no temples. So he was just glorifying Hridhayananda Maharaj. Just going on, just see Hridhayananda Maharaj's potency, he's enthusing book distribution, he's so wonderful. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj was, I believe, Tamal Krishna Maharaj was there. And as we know, that was 1976, that was the height of the competition with Radha Damodar and the other temples. That Prabhupada had incited this very fierce competition, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj wanted to be number one, and Prabhupada knew that he wanted to be number one. So, as Rameshwar was going on glorifying Prabhupada, glorifying Hridhayananda Maharaj again and again and again, Prabhupada stopped and said, don't speak so loudly, Tamal will have a heart attack. And everyone just cracked up. And that's that picture. And Prabhupada himself was laughing. Another morning walk, this was on Venice Beach, right around the area where we have Rath Yatra. And I think Dr. Stilson Judah was on that morning walk, and Bahulaswa was presenting Krishnan arguments. So he said, Srila Prabhupada, one of the arguments is that no one has seen God. Something that says in the Bible, I believe, no one has seen God. Something to that effect. And Prabhupada stopped and he said, no fool has seen God. He said, I am not a fool like you. I have seen God. So at another time in San Francisco, this was 1972, Prabhupada was had met another man, a scientist. And I wasn't at the darshan, but the next morning in class, Prabhupada was kind of joking about the darshan he had with this man. He said, last night I met an atheistic scientist and I called him a rascal. And Prabhupada was laughing. He said, I called him a rascal. And Prabhupada said, and he admitted it. And then Prabhupada said, I can do this. He said, but you cannot do this.